The silence was the first thing that was wrong. I've walked into a lot of empty places since the roads went quiet. Farmhouses with the supper dishes still in the drying rack. Gas stations with the pumps still humming on some last trickle of grid power. The little digital numbers frozen at whatever gallon the last customer had abandoned. A county clerk's office where the ceiling fans were still turning over a room full of nobody, stirring papers on the desks like the place was thinking about getting back to work. Empty places make noise. That's the thing people who haven't done this don't understand. They creak, they drip, they tick as the sun leaves the walls and the wood contracts. A refrigerator will run for days after the last person who owned it stopped breathing. A house settles and groans at night like an old man in a chair. Emptiness has a sound, and you learn to listen to it, because the day the sound stops is the day you need to be somewhere else. But when I came over the rise on that gravel lane in LaGrange County and saw the little white schoolhouse sitting in the frost, there was nothing. No birds. And in Indiana in January there are always birds, sparrows and juncos, working the seed heads in the fence rows. Crows arguing somewhere off toward the tree line. No wind in the corn stubble, though the stubble was standing dry and papery in the field beside the school, and should have been rattling. Not even the low animal hum you feel more than hear when something is breathing nearby, a cow in a barn, a dog under a porch, the great slow respiration of a place that still has living things in it. The whole scene was laid out flat and gray under a sky the color of dirty wool, and it was as quiet as a photograph. And photographs don't make me reach under the seat for the tire iron the way that quiet did. And the door was open, not broken. That mattered, and I stood there working out why it mattered. A broken door tells a story you can read at a glance. Men with a crowbar, or the sickness coming through in a mob or a storm. A broken door is violence, and violence is at least something you understand. But this door was open the way you leave a door when you step out for a moment and mean to come right back, standing just wide enough for a person to pass through sideways. No damage to the frame, no boot marks on the paint, the latch hanging easy. A child's coat still hung on the peg beside it, small and black and buttoned all the way up to the throat, the way a mother buttons a coat when it's cold out and the child won't sit still. Like someone had dressed a kid against the winter, and then the winter had swallowed them whole and left the coat behind as the only proof they'd ever stood there. I stood at the fence line with my bare hand on the cold wire, feeling the metal pull the heat out of my palm. And I did the math the way I always do now, because the math is the only thing that's kept me alive. 26 days since the outbreak reached this part of Indiana. I'd been counting since Fort Wayne, scratching a mark into the dash of the truck each dawn with my pocket knife. 26 marks now. A little picket fence of them going gray with dust. No power lines out here to begin with. I noted that first thing. No poles marching along the lane, no wire, because this was plain country, and these people had never asked the grid for anything. No cell towers they'd ever used. This community had gone dark before the world did, on purpose, generations back. And that was supposed to make it safer. That was the whole reason I'd turned up the lane. So why was a schoolhouse full of children's coats, standing wide open and dead silent in the middle of a killing winter? Before I take you the rest of the way through that door, I want to say something plain. Thank you to those of you who keep coming back to sit with these stories. And if this is your first night here, welcome. If this kind of grounded, quiet survival horror is your sort of thing, stay with the channel, leave a comment, and keep listening. It matters more than you know. Now let me tell you what I found inside, because I've not been able to put it down since, and I've had a long time to try. My name is Elias Vandermeer. I was 51 years old the winter the world came apart. Gray at the temples and heavier in the joints than I like to admit. And for most of my life, I built and repaired the mechanical things other men had forgotten how to fix. Windmills, mostly. The tall skeletal ones that pull water up out of the ground with nothing but a breeze and a length of sucker rod. Water pumps and the deep well cylinders that go down 40 feet into the dark. Cast iron stoves and the long flat leather belts that ran threshing machines off tractor engines back before everything went to hydraulics. I grew up old order in Wayne County, Ohio, the fourth of 9 children. Left the church at 19 with my father's disappointment following me down the drive, and spent 30 years afterward as an in-between man, the kind of contractor the plain communities call when they need a thing built to modern strength but installed without a single wire in it. I knew the country roads of northern Indiana and southern Michigan the way most men know the hallways of their own house, in the dark, by feel. I knew which farms had windmills, and which had gone over to diesel generators, run only on the days the ordning allowed. And I knew, better than almost anyone left alive, I think, how a place with no electricity survives when the electricity everywhere else has failed. That knowledge is why I was still breathing on day 26. It's also why I turned off the state highway and drove my rattling old truck up that gravel lane toward the schoolhouse instead of past it. The plain communities were the one kind of place that hadn't collapsed the way the cities had. I'd seen the cities, or the edges of them. I didn't need to see the middles. But these people didn't need the grid to keep the lights on, because they'd never had lights to keep. They kept root cellars and smokehouses and hand pumps and draft horses and seed saved back from last year's harvest in mason jars in the cellar. They had food that didn't depend on a freezer humming somewhere in a substation 2 counties over. If anyone in this whole ruined stretch of country was still living something like a normal life, waking with the sun and going to bed with it, milking and mending and baking bread in a wood-fired oven, it would be people like the ones I'd grown up with and walked away from. I had spent 3 days convincing myself of that. I'd driven the back roads, telling myself the story out loud in the empty cab, the way a man does when he's alone too long. I'd been alone since Fort Wayne, since the thing I don't talk about happened to the 2 people I'd been traveling with, a mechanic named Ferris and his sister. And I needed the story I was telling myself to be true, the way a drowning man needs the next breath. I needed there to be a lit window somewhere at the end of one of these lanes, an oil lamp burning gold behind wavy old glass, and people behind it who hadn't been touched, who were still saying grace over supper as if the world outside their fence hadn't ended, so that I could sit down at the edge of their light and believe for one night that some part of the old life had held. The schoolhouse told me otherwise before I ever reached the porch. It was a good building. I want you to see it the way I did, because a man in my trade sees a building the way a doctor sees a body, reading its health at a glance. White clapboard, freshly painted the summer before, you could tell by the way the color still held, even through the grime of a hard season. No gray weathering showing through yet at the nail heads. A single long room with tall windows on the south and east walls to catch the light, because these schools ran on daylight, not bulbs. And the whole building was oriented on its lot, to drink up as much winter sun as the short days would give. A little bell tower with no bell in it yet. The community must have been saving toward one. The rope coiled neat on its cleat and waiting for a bell that would never come now. A separate woodshed off to the side, its doors shut against the weather. A hand pump standing in the yard with a tin cup chained to it for the children, the chain frozen stiff and the cup half far full of a disk of gray ice. 2 outhouses set back at a decent distance, a boy's and a girl's, painted the same white as the school. A hitching rail at the edge of the yard where the older scholars would have tied the pony that pulled the cart of little ones in from the farther farms. Everything built by hand, everything maintained, everything squared and plumb, and exactly where it should be. Because these are people who believe that how you keep your buildings is how you keep your soul. And all of it wrong in the way a photograph is wrong when someone has been carefully cut out of it, so that the shape of their absence is the loudest thing in the frame. I called out from the yard, "Not loud. You learn not to be loud, you learn it fast, or you don't get to keep learning anything." Just enough to carry to the open door, pitched low and flat. "Anybody in there? I'm not sick. I'm not armed for trouble. I fix things. I've got water to spare." My breath hung in front of me in a cloud and drifted off. And I watched it go. And that was the only movement in the whole yard. Nothing came back but my own voice off the clapboard, thinner than it had left me. I went up the 2 steps onto the porch and stopped, my hand on the cold rail, because now I could smell it. Not death. That was the thing that kept me from turning and walking straight back to the truck right then. There was no smell of death. None of that thick, sweet, rotten horror I'd learned to read the way you read a change in the weather. The smell that means turn around. The smell that had hung over Fort Wayne like a fog you could taste. Instead, there was wood smoke gone cold. That flat, ashy tang that a stove leaves in a room for days after the last fire. And chalk. The dry schoolroom smell of it. And underneath both of those, faint, the mineral bite of a cast-iron stove that has been fired long and hard through a cold snap and then allowed to die out slow. And under even that, fainter still. So faint I had to stand still and breathe through my nose to be sure of it. Something like lamp oil, kerosene, the smell of a wick recently trimmed. Someone had kept this place warm. Recently. And then stopped. I stepped inside, and the floorboards took my weight without a sound. Well-seasoned pine laid tight by someone who cared how a floor felt underfoot. The desks were still in their rows, small ones up near the stove at the front, larger ones toward the back, the way a one-room school arranges its children by age, so that the littlest ones stay closest to the heat. I counted the desks without meaning to. A habit, 22 of them. And I thought, that's a healthy school. That's a growing settlement. That's a place with a future. Slates lay on the desktops, gray and cool. Some of them had sums half finished in a child's careful hand, columns of figures worked down part way, the chalk lines not smudged, not wiped, as if the students had been called away between one number and the next, and had every intention of coming back after to finish the borrowing on a subtraction problem that would now never be borrowed. On the big board at the front, in the wide, clear hand of a schoolteacher, someone had written the date in the old German script along the top, and beneath it, a Bible verse in English, because these schools taught both languages, the German for God and the English for the world. The verse was Psalm 46, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." Whoever wrote it had underlined the last 3 words twice, pressing hard enough that the chalk had crumbled at the end of the second stroke. I moved down the center aisle, slowly, letting my eyes adjust, taking it in. The floor was scrubbed pine, worn pale in a broad path from the door to the stove to the teacher's desk, the map of 10,000 small feet crossing it morning after morning. My boots were the loudest thing in the county, and I hated the sound of them. On the teacher's desk at the front sat a handbell. Brass, the kind you ring to call the children in from the yard, and a Bible worn soft at the corners, and a neat stack of copybooks squared to the edge of the desk, and a kerosene lamp with the wick trimmed clean and the reservoir better than half full of oil. And beside the lamp, set square on the blotter, someone had laid a plate. On the plate were 3 pieces of bread, dry now, curling a little at the edges but not moldy, and a boiled egg with the shell peeled off and left in a small heap beside it, the way you peel an egg for a young child who can't manage the shell. A child's portion. A packed lunch, set out and waiting. The kind of thing a mother leaves so a little one will eat while she steps out to do a chore. Nobody had touched it. In a world where I had watched grown men fight over a can of beans, nobody had come back for a boiled egg. I opened the door of the stove at the front and put my bare hand inside the firebox, down past the cold gray crust of the top ash, working my fingers down through it slow. And there, at the very bottom, under an inch of dead ash, the ash was still faintly warm. Not warm from today, but not stone cold either, the way a firebox goes cold after a week. This was maybe a day old, maybe two if the building held its heat well. And a building this tight, this well built, would hold heat like a thermos. That's when I understood the first thing. And it made the back of my neck go cold in a way the January air hadn't managed. This was not a place people had fled from in a panic weeks ago. The dust would have been thicker, the food long gone to rot or vermin, the stove stone dead. This was a place people had been living in, sheltering in, keeping warm, doing sums and packing lunches and trimming wicks, as recently as a day or two before I walked through the door. And then, sometime in the last 48 hours, every single one of them had walked out the front door into an Indiana January and left a child's lunch on the plate and a coat on the peg and gone silent. People don't do that, especially not these people. These are people who bank a fire at night with a shovel full of ash over the coals so it can be blown back to life in the cold black of the next morning. Who would no more waste a peeled boiled egg than they would waste a spoken prayer. Because to them the two things are close to the same. Something had made them leave in a way that broke every single habit these people had built their whole lives around. And they had left so quietly, so completely, that they hadn't even taken the food off the plate. I said the second half of Psalm 46 out loud without meaning to. The part that wasn't written on the board. The part I still had by heart from a boyhood of memorizing verses in a room just like this one. Be still and know. And from somewhere behind the schoolhouse, out past the woodshed, something answered me. Wasn't a groan. It wasn't the wet, gargling sound the infected make when they've been out in the cold too long, and the tissue in their throats has started to go slack and rotten. I knew those sounds. I'd have understood those sounds. This was a knock. 3 slow knocks on wood, evenly spaced, patient, the way a man knocks on a neighbor's door when he knows you're home and he's willing to stand on the porch and wait for you to get up and come. I stood very still in that scrubbed pine aisle with a dead child's lunch on the desk in front of me and my heart going hard against my ribs. And I listened to something knock. 3 times, from a direction that had no business having anyone in it. Then I heard the voice. It was a boy's voice, young, maybe 9 or 10 by the pitch of it, and it came from the same direction as the knocking, muffled, coming up as if through a floor or through the ground itself. It said one word, in the flat, plain accent I'd grown up inside of. The accent I'd spent 30 years trying to sand off my own tongue. And the word was, Mama. I have made a lot of mistakes since the world ended. Some of them cost people their lives, and I carry every one. But I want you to understand that when a child's voice comes up out of the ground in a silent place asking for its mother, there is no version of me, no version of any man I would ever want to be, that walks back out to his truck and drives away. I knew it could be a lure. I'd seen the infected mimic in their broken, damaged way. The last sounds they'd made as people, a name, a word, a fragment of a hymn, worn down and repeated like a scratched record. I knew it could be a trap set by someone still living. because I had learned by then, learned the hard way outside Fort Wayne, that the living were the ones who set the cleverest traps. I knew all of that, and I stood there, and I knew it, and it didn't matter. I went out the back door anyway. The woodshed was between me and the sound. Behind it, the land dropped away into a shallow hollow I couldn't have seen from the road, a fold in the pasture where the community had put a thing I hadn't known was there. A long, low mound of earth with a heavy wooden door set into its uphill side and a length of stovepipe rising out of the top of it, capped against the rain. A root cellar, but bigger than any root cellar I'd ever seen or built, dug deep and long back into the hillside. The whole thing banked over with sod so thick that it had greened even now, in dead winter, where the warmth from inside had kept the grass alive. The kind of communal shelter a whole church district builds together over one summer of frolics and shared labor. Dug deep enough and banked heavy enough to hold 50 degrees inside in January and 50 degrees again in July. The stovepipe was not smoking, but there was a ring of melted frost around its base, where warmth had risen recently through the metal and thawed the ground. A dark circle of bare, wet earth in the white of the frost, like a thing had been breathing there. The knocking was coming from the door set into the side of the mound, and the door was barred from the outside. A heavy oak beam had been dropped into a pair of hand-forged iron brackets bolted across the door, the way you bar a barn door against a winter storm so the wind can't work it loose. Someone had sealed this cellar shut from the outside and walked away and left the bar in place. The boy's voice came again, closer to the door now, and this time it wasn't asking for his mother. This time it said in a rush, all the words tumbling over each other. "Is somebody there? Please. We can't get out. The bar's on the outside and we can't reach it. We tried. We can't reach it. Please, mister, whoever you are, don't be one of the sick ones. Please be a person. Please be a real person." I put my hand flat on the oak beam. It was heavy, 4 inches by 4 and green cut, and it was cold enough to sting my palm. And it had been placed there deliberately and squarely by someone strong enough to lift it up over their head into the brackets. I looked back over my shoulder at the silent white schoolhouse, with its open front door and its cold stove and its waiting lunch. And I understood, all at once and completely, that the children hadn't walked out into the winter at all. The coats on the pegs, the lunch on the plate, the sums half finished. They hadn't left. Someone had walked them down here into the ground, and then someone had locked the door behind them. I lifted the bar. It was heavier than it looked, and I had to set my legs and take the weight in my back. And it came up out of the brackets with a groan of wood on iron. And I set it down against the sod as gentle as I could. I want to tell you what came out of that cellar, because it wasn't what I expected, and it changed the whole shape of everything that followed. The door swung outward on its leather hinges, and the smell hit me first, before I could see anything, rolling out of the dark on the warmer air from inside. The smell of a lot of people who have been breathing the same close air for too many days. Unwashed bodies, and the greasy tang of tallow candles, and the sharp ammonia sting of a slop bucket that has been used too long in a corner with nowhere to empty it. And under that, the good smells, potatoes and turnips, and cured ham, and the dry sweetness of stored apples, the smell of a full larder, so that the whole place smelled like survival and desperation braided together into one breath. And then the thin, cold light from the open door fell down into the dark, and I saw them. Children. My eyes counted them before my mind caught up. 11 of them, ranging from a girl of maybe 14 down to a boy so small he couldn't have been more than 4. Every one of them in plain dark clothing, gone gray with cellar dust. And every one of them pressed back against the far earthen wall away from the light, the way animals press themselves into the back of a stall away from a thing they've learned to fear. And with them, only 2 adults among all those children. An old woman, easily 80, sitting very upright on an overturned wooden crate with an unlit lantern beside her on the packed dirt floor. A lantern she'd let go dark to save the last of the oil. And a young man, 19 or 20, standing square between the children and the door with a hayhook in his fist. The long curved iron of it catching the light, holding it low and ready to swing it up into whatever the opening door turned out to be. When the light showed him that I was a man and not a monster, a living face and not a dead one, the hayhook lowered a few inches. But it did not drop, and his eyes did not leave me, and I respected him for that, because dropping it would have been a mistake, and this was a young man who had stopped making mistakes. "English," the old woman said. It wasn't a question, and there was nothing unkind in it. It was simply her naming what I was. An outsider, a man from the world that had the wires running through it. Her voice was steady in a way that 80-year-old voices are only steady when the person behind them has already made their peace with dying, and simply decided that it could wait a little longer if it needed to. "You lifted the bar." "I heard the boy," I said. My own voice came out rough. "I heard knocking." That was Amos. She nodded toward a small boy near her feet, the one who had been asking after his mother, a solemn child with a cowlick standing straight up at his crown. "He knocks every hour, on the hour, near as we can keep the hour down here. We take turns at it. We didn't think there was anyone left alive to hear it." She looked at me steady out of pale eyes that had gone milky blue at the very edges, but still saw plenty. Saw straight through to the middle of me, I thought. "You'll be wanting to know who put the bar on the door. You have that look. The look of a man who is already asking himself the question." "Ma'am," I said, "I've got 11 children in a hole in the ground, and 1 oak beam across the only door out. Yes, I want to know who put it there. And I want to know why the schoolhouse up top is set for people who aren't sitting in it." The young man with the hayhook spoke then, and there was something in his voice I've thought about nearly every day since. Not fear. Fear I could have understood, fear I'd have known what to do with. It was a kind of raw, scraped-open betrayal. The voice of a young man who has had the whole ground of his life pulled out from under him, who has watched the people he trusted most and loved best do a thing that his heart cannot make fit with anything he believed about them. "It was Bishop Zook," he said, "and my father, and the other men, all of them together. They told us the sickness was coming up the county road from the south, that it had already reached the Yoder place over the section line, that Mervyn Yoder had come running across the fields with the news before he fell down in our yard, and they had to see to him. They said we had 1 night, just the 1 night, to hide the children where the sickness couldn't find them. So we brought them all down here, all the young ones, every child in the district, and my Grandmother Fisher there to mind them, and me to guard the door." He swallowed, and his throat worked. "And then the men went back up to the schoolhouse to pray through the night and keep watch. And in the dark, in the middle of the night, I heard the bar come down across the door from the outside. And I called out. I put my hands on the door, and I called out to know what they were doing. And my father, my own father, he said through the wood that it was for our safety, that the sickness couldn't reach us if the door was sealed against it, that they would come back at first light and lift the bar and let us all out into the morning." He stopped. The children behind him were all watching me now, 11 pale faces in the falling light. and not one of them made a single sound. And I understood in that moment that these were children who had learned, in the last handful of days, that silence itself was survival, that a cry could be the last sound you ever made. "That was 3 days ago," Gideon said, and his voice cracked down the middle on it. "Nobody came at first light. Nobody came at all. And every night since, we've heard them up there, walking around the schoolhouse, around the top of this cellar, right over our heads." He tilted his face up toward the low earthen ceiling, as if he could still hear the feet through the sod. "But they don't talk anymore. Not one word in 3 days. And Amos, 2 nights back, he put his ear up against the stovepipe to listen. And he came away, and he wouldn't say anything for a long time. And then he said the sounds they make now aren't people sounds. I understood it all then. Standing in that doorway with the winter at my back and 11 silent children in front of me and an old woman looking straight into me. And it was worse than a locked door, worse than any trap the living could have set. The men of this community had done the one thing their whole faith and their whole hard-earned practical wisdom had trained them to do. When they saw danger coming, they had gathered the children into the strongest, safest, best-hidden shelter they possessed. A cellar dug deep in the earth, and they had sealed it tight against the world. And they had put their own bodies up top as the wall between that shelter and the threat coming up the road. Every instinct they had was to protect. They had bet their own lives on that oak door holding, and the sickness had not come up the county road at all. Poor Mervyn Yoder had not been the front edge of it. He had been proof it was already among them, already inside the wall. One of their own men, or maybe the bishop himself, had carried it in without knowing. In that first quiet stage where a person feels only tired, only a little warm, before the fever crests and burns the mind out of them. They had sealed the healthy children safely down in the earth. And then, up above in the schoolhouse, where they'd gathered on their knees to pray for deliverance, the men had turned, one after another, through the long night, in the dark, into the very thing that they had gone up there to guard the children against. The bar on the door hadn't kept the sickness out. It had kept 11 children sealed in the only building for miles that was now surrounded on every side by everyone who had ever loved them. And I had just opened the door. If you had been standing where I was standing, with the weight of that bar in your hands, and that thin, cold light falling down onto those 11 pressed-back faces, would you have lifted it before you knew what was walking up top? I have asked myself that 100 times in the years since. Tell me in the comments what you would have done, because to this day, I do not know if I was right. I got the door drawn most of the way closed again, quick and quiet. But I did not put the bar back across it, because there was not one power on this earth that was going to make me seal children into the ground a second time. I set my back against the door, and I made myself breathe slow, and I made myself think. How many men went up to the schoolhouse to pray? I asked the old woman. 9, she said, without a pause, as if she'd been counting them over in her mind for 3 days. The bishop and 8 of the fathers. And then 2 of the mothers who wouldn't be parted from their little ones went up after, to carry food to the men and to be near their children, and they didn't come back down neither. She folded her spotted hands together in her lap. 11 up top, and 11 down here below, counting the children only. God has a way with numbers, English. I've watched him do it my whole long life. He balances his books. 11 infected. That was the number I had to carry in my head now, alongside the 26 days scratched on my dash and whatever else I was keeping count of. 11 grown adults, most of them farmers. Men who had swung an axe and forked hay and wrestled livestock every single day of their lives. Now moving in that slow, patient circuit around the schoolhouse and the mound. drawn to it by the warmth rising off it and the sounds coming out of it and whatever broken memory the sickness had left them of the children they had sealed into the ground with their own hands. That was why I hadn't seen a single one of them from the road. They didn't lurch and stagger and moan the way people who've never seen the real thing imagine. In the deep cold, they moved slow and quiet, going still for long stretches, banking whatever was left in them the way you bank a fire. And they had learned, in whatever dim and broken way the sickness allows a thing to learn, that the children were down in the ground and that the door in the side of the mound was the way to reach them. They had been circling that door for 3 days. They would know exactly where it was. "The stovepipe," I said to the young man. His name I had by then, Gideon Zook, the bishop's own grandson. "You said Amos put his ear to it to listen. That means it comes up somewhere out in the open, up top. Where exactly?" "Behind the woodshed," Gideon said. "There's a little tin cap on the end of it to keep the rain out. We had a fire in the stove the first day to keep the little ones warm. But we let it die down and go out, because we were afraid the smoke coming up the pipe would tell the sick ones where we were." Smart. Terrible and cold and heartbreaking and smart. A whole community of people who did not, even sealed in the earth in the dark, with the dead walking over their heads, come apart at the seams. These were not people who fell to pieces. These were people who had spent generations making hard, plain, practical choices, and then living with them without complaint. And that, I understood right then, was going to be the only thing that saved us, because I was going to need every one of them to make several more hard choices before this was through. "All right," I said. "Here is the shape of it. I've got a truck up on the lane, but it's a good 150 yards through open pasture from that cellar door to where I've got it parked. And every foot of that open ground is somewhere those 11 can walk. They're slow in the cold. But slow doesn't mean nothing. Not when you're counting a 4-year-old's legs against them. We cannot outrun them across open ground, carrying the little ones. Not all of us. Not before some of them close the distance." "Then we don't go across the open," Gideon said. "No," I agreed, and I looked at him, this exhausted young man with a hay hook, and I saw that he was quicker than his grief was letting him be. "No, we don't." And that was the moment I stopped being a man who had wandered in off the road, following a boy's voice, and became the man responsible for getting 11 children up out of a hole in the ground, while the risen bodies of their own fathers circled overhead in the falling dark. I have built a great many things in my life. Windmills that still turn, barns that will outlast the men who raised them. I had never, in 51 years, built anything that mattered the way the next few hours were going to matter. I told them what I knew about the sickness, because they needed to know it, and because knowing was the only real weapon I had to give them. I crouched down there in the dim cellar so I'd be closer to eye level with the children, and I kept my voice low and even, the way you'd talk to spooked horses. And I told them plain. I told them the sickness hunts by warmth and by sound, that a living body glows to it in the cold like a lamp in a window, that in hard weather it slows almost to a stop, goes quiet and stiff, but never sleeps, that it can't see much at all, its eyes go bad early, but that it hears everything, a cough, a whisper, a stone kicked loose, that it doesn't feel cold or pain or tiredness, that it never stops on its own, but that it also isn't clever, that it follows the last thing it noticed until something newer and louder pulls it off. I told them the fever burns through a person in about a day, that once a person turns, there is no coming back from it. None, that I had watched better men than me pray over it through a whole night and get nothing back for the praying but a bite. The old woman, Grandmother Fisher, listened to every word of it with her hands folded still in her lap. and when I finished, she said something I have carried with me every day since. "You think you're standing there telling us that the sickness has taken our men from us?" she said, gentle, almost patient with me. "But our men are already gone home to God, English. What's walking up there now in Isaac's boots and in Levi's good black coat? That is not our men anymore. That is only the sickness, wearing them out like a set of borrowed Sunday clothes, and it will wear them clean through soon enough, so you don't have to go easy on it, not on our account. Whatever it is you have to do to get these children up into the light, you do it, and you let the guilt of it be mine to carry, an old woman's, who by God's mercy won't be carrying it long." She turned her milky eyes to the children pressed against the wall. "Just don't let them see their father's faces. If there's any way in the world you can help it. That much only I'll ask of you. Let the last thing they hold on to be a memory of a man kneeling at prayer, and not what the prayer turned into, that much." I gave her my word on it, and in all the long years since I have kept very few promises as hard as I kept that one. The cellar, once my eyes had drunk in the dark, was better built than I'd feared and worse stocked than I'd hoped. And both of those facts were going to matter. It ran maybe 30 feet back into the hillside, timbered along the walls with rough-adzed oak posts and lintels, the ceiling low enough that Gideon had to duck his head under the beams as he moved. Along one whole wall stood the community's winter larder, or what was left of it. Wooden bins of potatoes and turnips and beets going soft and sprouting pale in the dark. Long shelves crowded with glass mason jars that caught what little light there was and gave it back in dull green and gold. Cured hams and slabs of bacon wrapped in cloth and hung from the beams up out of the reach of mice. This was the whole district's food. Everything a dozen families had put up together against the winter. Everything they were counting on to carry them through to the spring planting. There was a little sheet iron stove near the door, the kind you can pack in a wagon, its pipe running up through a collar in the sod roof. There was a scatter of quilts and straw ticks along the floor where the children had been bedding down. There was the slop bucket in the far corner that I'd smelled from the door. There was a big glazed water crock, and when I tipped it, I heard it was down to a few inches sloshing in the bottom. And there was the one lantern beside Grandmother Fisher with maybe an hour of oil left in its belly. An hour of light. That was the first number that truly frightened me after the 11. "How much water have you got?" I asked. "That crock and whatever's put up in the jars," Gideon said. "The pump's up top in the open. We haven't dared go to it." "Food we've got," Grandmother Fisher said. "For months, if it came to that. It's the water and the light and the good air that'll finish us long before the food does. That little stove is the only heat, and we're afraid of the smoke, so we go without. And without heat, the small ones." She let it trail off. She didn't need to finish it. I had already noticed. The 4-year-old, little Enos, Amos's baby brother, was too quiet and too still, curled deep down in a quilt with a flush high on his round cheeks that in a warm, bright room might have meant nothing at all. But that down here in the cold and the fouled air and the fear meant everything. I knelt and put the back of my hand against his forehead. He was hot. Not sickness hot, I told myself, not the killing fever that turns a person, that comes with the other signs, the eyes, the tremor. Just a small child's ordinary fever, brought on by cold and bad air and days of terror. But down here, with no medicine, no clean water to bring it down, no way at all to tell the ordinary kind from the killing kind until it was far too late to matter. An ordinary fever could take a 4-year-old just as surely and just as final as the sickness could take a grown man. And that changed my arithmetic all over again. I had been standing there, thinking I had time. Time to plan it careful. Time to wait for full dark to cover us. Time to do this slow and quiet and right. I did not have that time. Little Enos did not have 3 more days in him. He might not have 1. Whatever it was I was going to do, I was going to have to start doing it soon. In the flat, cold light of a fading January afternoon, with 11 infected, circling the mound, and the sun already leaning down hard toward the black line of the western trees. This is a good place to stop a moment and ask you something. Because I have never once fully forgiven myself for the choice I made next. And I would honestly like to know how you would have called it. Sitting where I was sitting. I had a truck out on the lane that could carry, if I packed it tight and put children on children's laps, maybe 6 people. And I had 11 children, 1 old woman, 1 young man, and myself. 15 souls. 1 trip in that truck could not take everyone, not close to it. So do you make a run with the truck packed full, and then come back for the rest, and pray to God the second group lives through the wait? Or do you find some other way and refuse from the very first to split them up at all? Tell me what you would have done. I have needed to hear it for a long time now. I chose not to split them. I'll tell you why, and then I'll tell you what it cost, and you can weigh the two and decide for yourself whether I was a fool. I chose not to split them because the very moment that truck engine turned over and pulled away down the lane with 6 children in the bed, the 11 up top would follow the sound and the motion of it. At least some of them would break off and lumber after it, and I did not know how many. And the ones that didn't follow would be left with a barely guarded cellar and the fear smell of the children left behind, pouring up out of the stovepipe like a dinner bell. And I did not trust myself to get back through all of that in time. I had made a promise once before, outside Fort Wayne, that I would come back for someone, that I would only be gone an hour. And the coming back had taken too long, far too long. And I do not talk about what I found when I did. I was not, ever again, going to drive away from people I was responsible for with a plan in my head to return for them. Whatever I did here, I was going to do it with every last one of them in front of my own eyes the whole time. So I needed the 11 up top to be somewhere other than in the strip of ground between us and the truck, and to move 11 infected off a spot. You cannot fight them, and you cannot fool them for long. You have to give them something they want worse than they want you. Warmth, sound, the promise of prey, something newer and louder than the thing they're already fixed on. I looked at that little sheet iron stove and its pipe running up and through the sod behind the woodshed, and slow, piece by piece, I started to build a plan out of the things this community had left behind them in the dark. Here is what I knew, and here is how I built it. The infected had been circling the schoolhouse and the mound for 3 days because that was where the children were. That was where the warmth had been. That was where the last living human sounds had come from. If I lit that little stove hot, drove it hard, and let the smoke come pouring up out of the pipe behind the woodshed, and if I made noise there, banging metal on metal, hammering on the pipe, on the cellar walls, I believed I could draw all 11 of them in tight around the back of the mound, around the woodshed, and hold them there, away from the front of the schoolhouse and away from the wide-open pasture beyond it that led out to the lane and my truck. But I could not be down in the cellar making that noise, and up on the lane behind the wheel of the truck at the same time, and there was no one else among us who could drive. Gideon had never sat behind a wheel in his life. Neither had any of the rest of them. Which meant that someone had to stay behind and make that noise. Alone, down in the cellar, with the 11 of them pressing in against the door and crowding around the stovepipe, and hold their whole attention long enough for the rest of us to get up out of the ground and across all that open pasture and away clean. And then after that, someone had to have a way out of the cellar that didn't lead straight through the middle of the 11. There wasn't one. And that was the hole in the plan I could not fill, no matter how many times I walked around it in my mind. The cellar had one door and one door only. The stovepipe was 6 inches of tin, no bigger. Whoever stayed behind to draw the dead was staying behind for good, unless by some mercy the 11 wandered off into the fields in the night. And they had not wandered off in 3 days, and they were not going to wander off, now that the whole warm, live smell of us was thick in the air over that mound. I stood there in the dark, and I turned the problem over and over, the way I'd turn a broken casting, looking for the flaw, and it kept coming out the same way every time. Somebody had to stay. And I was the only one who could drive the truck, the only one who knew these back roads in the dark, the only one who knew the sickness and how it moved. Which meant, by every cold, hard line of the arithmetic, that the one who stayed behind to die was not going to be me. Grandmother Fisher had been watching my face the whole while I worked it through. She always was. I would come to learn that there was very little that happened on a person's face that she didn't read. "You found the price of it," she said quietly, into the dark. "I can see that you have. It's written all over you. So say it out plain. I'm far too old for a man to be careful with me now." "Someone stays down in the cellar," I said. And my mouth had gone dry saying it. "And makes noise, and keeps the fire going, to draw them all around to the back of the mound. The rest of us go up and out the front and across the pasture to the truck. And whoever stays, the sickness comes to the door and the pipe, and it stays there with them. And it doesn't follow us." I made myself say the last of it. "And whoever stays doesn't come out." Gideon started to speak, and I already knew what he was going to say before he had the breath to say it. And I could not let him say it, because he was 19 years old, and he had a whole life still ahead of him if I could just get him alive, to the far side of this night, and because these 11 children knew him, needed a face they trusted to be waiting for them on the other side. But it wasn't Gideon who spoke first. "I'll stay," said Grandmother Fisher. And she said it the way another woman might say she'd take the smallest slice, or the burnt piece of toast, with a small, easy graciousness, as though she were doing all the rest of us a quiet kindness that we might be too polite to accept from her. Now, don't the two of you go making faces at an old woman. I am 81 years old this past November. My Jonas has been in the ground 11 years. My own sons are up there this minute walking around in the cold, in their own bodies, with a devil at the reins. There is not one single thing waiting for me in the back of that truck. English. Not one thing in the whole wide world left out there. That I want the way I want these grandchildren of mine up in the light of day." She reached down and took little feverish Enos's small hand in her spotted one. "And I can make noise. Oh, for a good long while yet. My voice was famous through this whole district in my day. I could call the men in from the far 40 acres without ever touching the bell. I can beat on a stovepipe, and I can sing loud enough to draw every dead thing walking in LaGrange County right up to this door, and hold them here till morning, if morning's what it takes." "No," Gideon said. His voice broke clean in half on the word. "Grandmother, no. It has to be me. I'm the one who was set to guard this door. I'm the one who was standing right here when the bar came down. And I did nothing. I couldn't reach it. I did nothing. If anyone stays, it has to be me. That's only justice. That's the one thing in all of this that would be." "Hush now." and there was iron in it. The plain, flat iron of a woman who had run a household of a dozen souls for 60 years and settled 1,000 arguments across a kitchen table. You listen to me, Gideon Zook, and you hear me. You did not let that bar come down. Your father dropped it. Your father made that choice out of love and out of fear both. And it was the wrong choice, and it is not yours to pick up and carry. If you stay down in this cellar to die out of guilt over a thing you never did, then you will have gone and made the very same mistake your father made. Throwing a good life away after a fear, spending yourself on the wrong wall instead of spending yourself on these children who need you living now. Which one of you two knows how to drive that truck? He does, Gideon whispered, and would not look up. The English does. And which one of you do these children know by name? Which one of you have they trusted their whole short lives long? Which one of you can sit in the back of that truck holding little Enos and tell them all, in a voice they'll believe down in their bones, that it is going to be all right? Gideon didn't answer her. There was no answer to give but the true one, and the true one broke him, and he put the heel of his hand against his eyes. Then it's settled, she said, gentle again now, the iron put away. The English drives. You mind the children, and you keep them close, and you keep them quiet. And I'll make the noise. And nobody argues with an old woman about the spending of her own last afternoon on this earth. She turned her face up to me. You said the sickness follows the last thing it takes notice of, until something newer pulls it off. So you'll want to give me something loud, to make good and sure they stay taking notice of me and not of you and the little ones. Tell me what you want me to do, and I'll do it right. I have led men through hard things in my time. Frightened men, up on a tower in a lightning storm, down in a well that was filling faster than the pump could clear it. I had never once in my whole life felt as small as I felt right then, taking my instructions from that old woman on how best to arrange her own death so that 11 children could walk out into the light. But she was right. She was right about every single part of it. And the oil in that lantern was down to maybe 40 minutes now. And little Enos was getting hotter in the crook of my arm by the minute. So I stopped arguing with her. And I built the plan out with her the way I'd have laid out a raising with a good crew, each of us taking up the piece of it we were fit to carry. Here's what we did. I'm going to tell it to you straight. And in the order it happened, because the order of it was everything. First, we got the children ready to move without a single sound. Gideon and the oldest girl, Rebecca, went down the rows of them there in the near dark, quiet as anything, and dressed each child for the cold. Coats down off the memory of where the pegs would be, mittens, the heavy woolen scarves these people knit by the yard through the winter evenings. And then Rebecca did a thing that showed me the whole worth of her at once. She took a coil of clothesline down off a nail, and she tied the youngest 3 children wrist to the older ones. A little length of line between each, so that in the dark and the fear and the confusion of the run, not one small child could be dropped or lost or left behind or simply frozen in place. And she did it without being told. Nobody cried while she did it. I want you to sit with that for a moment, the way I have had to sit with it. Not one of those 11 children cried while they were being tied together in the dark to be led out past the walking bodies of their own fathers. They had learned, down in that hole in the ground, that crying was the one thing that could kill them. And they had learned it so deep and so young that it had become the plain shape of their obedience. It is the most terrible discipline I have ever witnessed in my life. And I pray to God that not one of you listening ever has cause to see the like of it. Second, I went up top alone in the last thin daylight to see the ground with my own 2 eyes and find where the 11 were standing. I went up the packed dirt cellar steps and I eased the door open just wide enough to lay one eye to the gap. And there was the winter afternoon, spread out gray and gone gold at the edges and going a deep cold blue in the low places, the light draining fast the way it does in January. And there were the men. They were exactly where the plan needed them not to be. 2 of them stood at the near front corner of the schoolhouse, facing out toward the open pasture and the lane. And though they could not see it from where they stood, facing more or less straight toward where I'd left my truck. 3 more were on the near side of the mound itself, close enough to the cellar door that I could have pitched a stone and hit them, standing in that slack, patient, head-hung way the infected stand when the cold has slowed them, as though they were listening to something down inside the earth. The other 6 I could hear but not yet see, off around the far side of the mound, back by the woodshed, near where the stovepipe came up, drawn to the spot where the last of the cellar's warmth had been leaking up out of the ground for 3 days. 6 already at the back, 5 at the front and near the door. I needed all 11 of them at the back, drawn in tight around that woodshed and that pipe, before I dared bring the children up out of the ground and out the front toward the open pasture and the lane. And I got my first good close look at them in the daylight. And I understood in my bones exactly why Grandmother Fisher had asked me the one thing she'd asked. I am not going to describe it to you. I have described a great many hard things tonight, and I will describe more before I'm done. But not this. It is enough for you to know that the cold had done certain things to them, and the sickness had done other things, and that they were still, every one of them, recognizably the men they had been in life. And that this was somehow the very worst part of it. Far worse than if they'd been strangers or monsters. You could still see, in the particular set of one man's shoulders, in the shape of another one's beard, the honest farmer who had stood in this very yard a week ago and leaned on his hay fork and watched his children run and play in the recess sun. Grandmother Fisher had it exactly right. What was left up there was only the sickness, wearing them out like a set of borrowed clothes. But the clothes still fit them, and a man's own body knowing him, even after the man is gone out of it, is a horror I have never found the words for. And I hope I never do. I went back down into the cellar, and I told them it was time. And I told Grandmother Fisher exactly where the 11 were standing. The 2 at the front, the 3 by the door, the 6 at the back. And she took the report in and nodded once, slow, like an old general receiving word from a scout. 5 to draw, she said. The 2 at the front and the 3 by the door there. If we can get those 5 drawn around to the back with the other 6, then your road across the pasture is clear. She was already gathering up the things she meant to use. An iron stove poker to beat against the stovepipe. The brass handbell that Gideon had carried down from the schoolteacher's desk that first night. A tin wash basin she could hammer on like a drum. I'll start it soft and build it up. You don't want them all to break for the back at once. They'll pile up in a knot, and some of them will lose the thread of it and drift on back around to the front. You want them drawn steady, a little at a time, the way you call skittish stock across a barn lot. Now I'll gather them tight for you. You give me a count of 200 after I start to get them all pulled around behind and settled. And when you hear me start to sing, that will be your sign that they're all of them around the back and fixed on me. And that's when you take these children up and you go, and you do not stop for anything. What will you sing? I asked her. I don't rightly know why I asked. It made no difference at all to the plan. I think I only wanted to know. so I could carry the answer with me down whatever road came after. "The Loblied," she said. And something moved across her old face. Something that was almost a smile, and almost the opposite of one. "It's the hymn we sing second at every single service, and have done for 400 years, since our people were being drowned and burned in the old countries for it. Every last one of those men up there has sung that hymn 1,000 times over, on his knees, since he was smaller than little Enos. If there is anything at all left down inside them that remembers being a man, that remembers being one of God's own, it'll be that hymn that stirs it. And if there's nothing left, well, now it was fully a smile, though it broke my heart to see it. Then at the very least, the last thing I do in this world will be to sing the song my own mother taught me, and hers taught her, loud and slow, the way it is meant to be sung. There are far worse ways to leave this life, English. I have seen most of them, in 81 years. This is not one of them. I got the children lined up in the dark by the foot of the cellar steps, in the order we'd run them. Gideon at the front with the 3 littlest ones roped to his own wrists. Rebecca at the very back, counting heads with her hands. And me at the head of it all, at the door, with my hand on the leather hinge. Little Enos I would carry myself, wrapped tight in a quilt against my chest, his hot, small face pressed into the side of my neck. And through the cloth and my own coat, I could feel his heart going, too fast, too light, fluttering like a sparrow held in a fist. And then Grandmother Fisher went to the back of the cellar under the stovepipe, and she knelt down at the little sheet iron stove and struck a match to the kindling she'd laid, one dry, rasping scrape of it in the dark. And the flame caught, and she fed it. And she took up the iron poker, and she began, very softly, to beat it against the tin of the pipe. Tink, tink, tink. Up through 6 feet of packed sod and a length of thin tin, I heard the answer come back. A shifting up above, at the back of the mound. A weight coming off the front of the ground and moving, dragging, around toward the sound. The 3 that had been standing by the cellar door, drifting away from it, toward the tink of the poker. Tink, tink, tink. A little louder now, and steadier. And then she added the bell. One small, clear silver ring and another, that carried up and out over the frozen fields. And the fire in the little stove caught full and began to draw. And the smoke went up the pipe warm and thick and started to pour out the top of it. And I felt, more than heard, the last 2 of them, the pair from the front corner of the schoolhouse, come around the side of the mound toward the warmth and the smell and the ringing of that bell. All 11 of them now, gathering in at the back of the mound around the woodshed and the pipe, drawn in tight like moths to the one lit window in a black and frozen field. I counted to 200, and it was the longest count of my entire life. Each number a small stone laid down in the dark. Beside me at the door, Gideon was breathing slow through his open mouth to keep even that quiet. And I could hear one of the little ones roped to his wrist, beginning, very softly, to shake, the smallest tremor. And I reached over in the dark, and I laid my free hand down flat on that small, shaking shoulder and held it still. And after a moment, the shaking eased. And then, up above us, up through the sod, an old woman's voice rose up strong and clear and completely, utterly unafraid, out into a January dusk that was full of the walking dead. And Grandmother Fisher began to sing. I do not know the words of the Loblied. I couldn't have told them to you that night, and I can't tell them to you now. It is in the old High German, the Church German. These people have kept alive for 400 years in a country that long ago quit speaking it. But I knew the sound of it. Oh, I knew the sound of it down in my chest, because it was the sound of every plain church service I had sat squirming through as a boy on a hard bench beside my father. That slow, unaccompanied, note-by-note melody that no outsider on this earth has ever quite been able to follow, each single line of it drawn out impossibly long and slow, the whole congregation moving through it together in one voice, like water finding its own level in a low place. She sang it alone. One old woman's voice where 100 should have been. And she sang it loud, loud enough to carry across every frozen field and fence row in that whole district, exactly the way she had promised me she would. And up above her, the 11 of them pressed in around the stovepipe and the woodshed, drawn tight, standing still now, listening the way the dead listen. And every last one of them had turned its back on the front of the mound and the open pasture and the lane where a truck sat waiting. I put my shoulder to the door, and I pushed it open. And the winter came pouring in, cold and clean, over all of us. And I said low and even, "Now, quiet, stay with me. Don't look back and don't stop, not for anything you hear." And we went up out of the ground into the last of the light. The open pasture between the mound and the lane was 150 yards of frozen ground, ridged and treacherous underfoot, churned and then frozen solid into ankle-turning ruts by the hooves of the community's cattle back before the freeze. And we crossed it in the deepening blue, with an old woman's voice at our backs singing a 400-year-old hymn to a congregation of the dead. I went first, with Enos burning against my neck, testing each footfall for the safe purchase before I trusted it my whole weight. And behind me came the line of them in the near dark. Gideon and the little ones roped to his wrists. Then the middle children 2 by 2. Then Rebecca at the rear, driving them all gently onward with her open hands laid flat on their backs and shoulders, moving them like a shepherd moving a flock through a gate. Nobody ran. Running on that broken ground would have meant a fall, and a fall would have meant a cry, and a cry, one single cry from one single child, would have ended every one of us where we stood. So we walked. We walked the way you walk out onto lake ice in the early winter when you're not yet sure it will hold you. Fast and smooth and low and terrified. Weight kept even, breath kept quiet. Behind us and off to our left, at the back of the mound, the 11 of them stayed put. I could see them clearly now, against the last gray light in the western sky. Dark shapes clustered in close around the woodshed, swaying just slightly, drawn in tight around the singing the way I had been drawn into that same hymn as a boy. And for one moment, God forgive me, I understood the sickness. I understood exactly what held it there. Because there is something down in that old slow hymn that reaches into the very oldest part of a person, older than reason, older than fear, and takes hold. And if the sickness leaves anything at all behind in a person, anything, then it had left just enough in those 11 to hold them fast there, listening while the children they had sealed into the earth with their own loving hands walked free across the open field behind their backs. We were halfway across, no more. The truck a low, dark shape now taking form against the fence line ahead. When the singing changed, it did not stop. That is the thing I most need you to understand about what happened next. It did not falter, and it did not break off, and it did not turn into a scream. It changed. Grandmother Fisher's voice, which had been coming up to us muffled, filtered through the pipe and the door and the 6 feet of packed sod, all at once came up clear and open and unmuffled, ringing out flat across the open air. And I understood in a heartbeat what she had done. It was the last piece, the piece we had not spoken of, the piece she must have decided on entirely by herself. down there in the dark, while she sang, calculating the odds the same cold way I calculate them. She had judged that the smoke and the bell and even her singing might not be quite enough. That one of them, two of them, might yet drift back around toward the moving smell of the children out in the open. And so she had gone to the cellar door, and she had opened it herself, from the inside, and she had climbed the packed dirt steps and stepped up out of the ground into the open yard, up into the very middle of them, still singing, to make good and certain, dead certain, that the last and newest and loudest thing every one of those 11 took notice of in the whole world was her and her alone. I heard the hymn go up into the darkening sky above that field with no walls left around it anymore. No sod, no tin. One old woman's voice standing alone, in the blue dark of a field full of her own, risen dead. And I heard it swell and grow prouder. And then I heard the 11 of them turn toward it all together, all at once, with a low dragging sound like a hard wind moving through a field of dead standing corn. And I did the single hardest thing I have ever done in my life, which was to keep walking, to keep my eyes fixed forward on the dark shape of that truck, to hold little Enos' fevered face tight against my neck and put one boot down in front of the other on that frozen broken ground, and not turn around. She sang the whole hymn through, every long, slow, drawn-out line of it, right to the end. It carried us the whole way across that field. And then, somewhere near the very end of the last verse, the singing stopped. The way a candle flame stops when you pinch it between wet fingers, all at once and completely. No fading, no trailing off, there and then not there. And the field behind us dropped back into silence, the very same silence I had walked into that afternoon coming over the rise and standing on the running board of my truck in the last of the light. I understood finally, all the way through, that the silence of that place had a source, that it was made, and that I had just heard it be made one more time by someone choosing to spend the last living breath in her body to buy 11 children a little more life. We reached the truck. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely work the tailgate latch. And when I got it down, Gideon began lifting the children up into the bed one at a time, quick and gentle, the littlest one still roped to his own wrists until the very last second so that not one could slip away in the dark. And Rebecca stood in the bed and took each child and counted it under her breath and pulled it down low. 10. And then I lifted Enos up into her arms, still wrapped in his quilt. 11. And Gideon came up over the tailgate last of all, and I pushed it shut behind him, as quiet as a thing like that will go. And I got in behind the wheel, and my hands would not stop shaking. And it took me 3 tries to fit the key into the switch in the dark. The engine caught on the 3rd turn. It is an old truck, and it has never once, in all the years I've owned it, let me down. And it did not let me down then either. I did not turn on the headlights. I put it in gear, and I let out the clutch slow. And I drove by the last thin ghost of the dusk down that gravel lane, away from the silent white schoolhouse with its open door, away from the dark mound with its cold, dead stovepipe, away from the 11 still shapes now standing motionless out in the yard where the singing had been. And I did not once look up into the mirror, and neither did any one of the children in the bed behind me, because they had been told not to, and because they had already learned, down in that hole in the ground, the terrible and complete discipline of not looking back. We drove all that night north, toward a place I knew of near the Michigan line, a Mennonite settlement that had gone quiet in a different way than this one. An empty way, a clean way, A way I had checked with my own eyes the week before and found free of the sickness. Sound roof, a hand pump in the yard that still drew sweet water, and a root cellar dug into a hillside not so different from the one we'd left. This one full of the kind of plain food that 11 children could live on for a long, long time. I got them there an hour before dawn. I got water into little Eno's, a spoonful at a time through the last of the dark. And by the second day, his fever had broken and run out of him. An ordinary child's fever, after all, just as I had prayed it was, and he lived. And as far as I know to this day, he is living still. A small, quiet boy grown older now, who knocks sometimes on doors and on tabletops and on the sides of things. 3 slow knocks, for no reason that anyone around him has ever been able to explain, and that I have never once had the heart to explain to them. I stayed with them 9 days, long enough to get the settlement's old windmill turning again, to free up a stuck break and replace a cracked pump leather, so that they would have water coming up out of the ground without ever having to send a child out to a pump in the open. Long enough to teach Gideon and Rebecca the hard, true things about the sickness that I knew, and they did not. How it hunts and how it slows, and how it never, ever comes back. Long enough to watch 11 orphan children and 1 19-year-old and 1 14-year-old, against every single thing the world had thrown at them, begin to knit themselves back together into something that looked, if you didn't look too hard, like a household. And then I did the thing I always do. I moved on. Because I'm an in-between man, I always have been. And a man like me is only ever passing through the middle of other people's lives, on his way to the next broken thing that needs a set of hands to fix it. But I want to tell you the thing that has stayed lodged in me all these years, the thing I turn over and over on the nights I can't find sleep, which are most nights now. The men of that community did everything their wisdom told them to do, everything. They saw danger coming up the road, and they gathered the children into the strongest, safest, best hidden place they had on this earth. And they sealed the door against the world, and they set their own bodies up as the wall between that shelter and the threat. Every instinct they had was to protect. That instinct is the most decent thing in a man. And that instinct, that good and loving and God-fearing instinct, is the exact thing that so very nearly killed 11 children, because they sealed the door against a threat that was already standing inside the wall, already in their own blood, already kneeling among them on the schoolhouse floor. And the locking in that they meant to be salvation would have been the tomb of every child in the district if a stranger hadn't happened up a gravel lane at the right hour and heard a boy knock 3 times on wood. The bishop who dropped that bar loved those children. Gideon's father loved him more than his own life and proved it and got it exactly wrong. That is the part I cannot get past and never have. It was not cowardice that locked that door, and it was not cruelty. It was love. Moving too fast, in the dark, with too little to go on. Choosing the wrong wall to build, and building it with everything it had. The betrayal those children felt. And it was betrayal. Real betrayal. Hearing the bar come down, and then hearing their own father's voices through the wood, telling them it was for their own good. That betrayal was as real as anything in this story. And it was also, in its own terrible turned-around way, the very last act of pure devotion those men ever performed with their right minds still inside them. I have spent a long time trying to decide who to lay it on. The bishop, for sealing the door. The father, for dropping the bar with his own hands. The sickness, for being already inside the wall and no way for anyone to know. Myself, for the choices I made in that cellar, for not splitting the truck, for letting an old woman spend her last afternoon on this earth so that I would not have to spend mine. So I'll leave the last of it with you. the same way I have left every hard thing with you tonight. Because I have never been able to set it down alone. Those men locked 11 children into the ground out of love, and it very nearly killed every one of them. Grandmother Fisher climbed up out of that same ground into a yard full of the dead and sang so that those same children could go free. And it did kill her. And it worked. One of those two choices we call a tragedy. The other one we call a sacrifice. And we tell it to children as a beautiful thing. But I have lain awake more nights than I can count now, wondering whether they were ever really so far apart. The bishop dropping that bar and the grandmother opening that door. Whether they weren't in truth the very same love, making the very same terrible bet with the very same stakes. And whether it was only luck, only the chance of a stranger passing on a gravel lane at dusk, that decided which one of them we would remember as the terrible one. Tell me what you think in the comments, because I have never once settled it in my own mind. Tell me where you're listening from tonight too, if you would, because I like to picture you out there in your own warm, quiet houses with the doors shut against the dark. And knowing you're there helps me more than you know. And then tell me this last thing, since it's the one question in all of this that I have never in all these years been able to answer for myself. If you had been the one down in that cellar, with the light burning down to nothing, and a truck out on the lane that could only carry so many, and an old woman looking you square in the eye and telling you, gentle as anything, that it had to be her, that it could only be her, what would you have done? Because I let her sing. And the field went quiet. And I have not been able to stand the quiet from that day to this.